Hi, and thank you for joining us. We'll begin in just a moment. We're just going to give everyone a chance to log in. Thanks. Again, thank you for joining us. If you just logged in, we're just going to give everybody a minute to log into the webinar. We'll be beginning shortly. Thanks. Hello, and welcome to the Miro Consulting webinar on 6 critical IBM licensing mistakes. My name is Sean Donahue, and I'm the VP of Marketing here at Miro Consulting. Joining me today is Miro Consulting's Sharon Tremblay, our Senior IBM Analyst. If you have any questions during the control panel, please use the question box in your webinar control panel, and we'll answer them at the end of the session. Please note that if you'd like to ask a question, we won't say who's asking the question, but we will read the question out to the audience and try to answer it the best we can in the time we have. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly explain who Miro is. Miro Consulting is a leading global provider of software asset management and subscription management services for Oracle, Microsoft, IBM, Adobe, and Salesforce. We specialize in license management, audit advisory, negotiation tactics, support management, and cloud services. Our mission is to help our clients maximize ROI on their software license and subscription investments, stay in compliance, and negotiate successful contract and audit settlements. And with that, let's start the presentation on 6 critical IBM licensing mistakes. Sharon?
Sure. The first mistake is to have no time for reading your licensing agreements, applying license metrics, or researching software titles. I mean, it's a very easy excuse because it could be, but it's also costly to simply not be aware of either the basics or even the nitpicky details. IBM software by itself is a broad field without even considering you have other software vendors and software in your environment. If you ignore the licensing agreement, which is called Passport Advantage Agreement, it's not going to help you for an audit to be ignorant of it. And this is a terrible excuse because the agreement's less than 10 pages, with less than half of that is something I consider as need to know. What's in it besides how software price levels work and the info about guarantees and warranties? There's IBM's right to audit the software you've deployed in your environment. So if you go back to Audit Basics 101, most of the time you'll see the prompt question if vendor has the right to audit you. So that's where you're going to find that answer is that IBM can audit you. Also in that same section of the agreement, compliance verification. IBM lists their audit rules. IBM hires an independent auditor, and if there's a license shortfall found, in addition to buying licenses, you could also be charged for 2 years of back support. The next 2 sections of the Passport Advantage Agreement are also important because it lists how you can license your servers by subcapacity rather than the default method of full capacity. If you have any kind of virtualization, whether it's VMware, Hyper-V, even IBM's own LPARs, subcapacity licensing is going to help you. You need less licenses when you're only licensing the allocated cores rather than the entire physical host. And in case you have any questions about software support, it's answered in Section 3.8 on IBM's software subscription and support. That's where the all or nothing phrase comes from. But you can reduce support to the quantity actively used, but be ready to document that for IBM because that's also in the agreement that they may ask you to prove it. Some people think it's easier to react. Why waste time when the auditor is going to tell me what I need to buy? But during a software audit, your options are limited. First, that's there's that 2 years of back support I mentioned. IBM requires you that you buy the licenses prior to deployment, so there's not a lot of wiggle room here, and that's in the passport agreement. If you have an ELA, it may have alternate terms that you can deploy then report, but generally you have to buy licenses before you're deploying IBM software. Proactive purchase of licenses did not require paying back support, and there's potential to negotiate a better price than your RSVP rate or your regular pricing outside of an audit. And secondly, there's the opportunity to review deployments for anything that's not needed or a potential better way to deploy. You have the ability to correct it and reuse licenses or buy licenses that better fit your usage. When an auditor finds it, it's added to a list of license shortfalls, and overall, they're reporting it as they see it, rather than what's best for you, either financially or forward-looking what you're going to need in your environment in the upcoming years. License metrics, some people make mistakes with that. You're going to have to accept that it's IBM software, so IBM sets the rules. And for most software products, IBM defines a lot online. It's not a conspiracy to hide the information, but there's a lot of different metrics. I have a couple of examples where the person that decides whether to buy more licenses or not made some assumptions that didn't align with IBM's metric definition, like for endpoint management that you might see with BigFix or other, Tivoli. IBM offers software with different license metrics. These are the even though IBM's selling BigFix to HCL, these license metrics are still going to exist for other products. The least expensive metric is client device. There are two others, resource value unit and managed virtual server, but price-wise, client device is less. Should the only rationale for a license purchase be the price? If you want to license this product for 1,000 servers, do you think it's okay to buy 1,000 client device licenses? IBM defines a client device as a single user computing device or a special purpose sensor or device. That can be your workstation, a cash register, a smart meter, a kiosk, a tape drive, but none of those examples come close to describing a server. IBM even tries to cover that by saying multiple client devices may share access to a common server. So if I have a store with multiple cash registers, card readers, and maybe some sensors in the ceiling, each of those would be a client device if I wanted to use this endpoint management software to keep an eye on them. The server they report into is separate and would require either an RVU or MVS license. For RVUs, IBM defines a resource for each software title, but here it's going to be the activated processor cores of the server. And an MVS, that can be either a virtual server or it can be a physical server that's not virtually partitioned. So in this case, you just can't buy client devices and think it covers your servers. My second example is more complex because saying who is a user or not trips people up. There's a lot of different user-based software products. So you may have to give this some study to choose the best metric for you, such as any floating, concurrent, or token users. Those are more expensive, but allows your users to share the licenses. One user, active user, can use one of those licenses. But the simple stuff is an employee user is all of them, and the contractors, even if they aren't using computers every day. So everybody as an employee, if you have an employee metric, has to be licensed. External user licenses are usually inexpensive because there may be many of them using your website to access what they need. But you can't use that inexpensive license to cover internal users. There may be also another user that would license that would be applicable to someone that works as your agent rather than your employee, but they're still not an external customer. They're working like price quotes for insurance or something. So that might be another class of users that is available for some software products. And the other one, the big one is, or most seen, is authorized user. And a lot seems to go wrong here, so let me explain a couple ways this metric may be misinterpreted. IBM defines an authorized user as someone you grant access to the software. Even if they never use it, you've given them access. So you need a license for every person that you've granted permission to use that software. That could be everyone in finance. It could be a backup person that only accesses it once a year. It could be a supervisor someone that receives reports from the software. There's a lot of potential users, but the trigger to needing a license is that person has been granted the permission to use it. You can reassign or reuse licenses if someone changes positions or leaves the company, though. So it's not, you're not perpetually buying more all the time. And don't use generic IDs, because then everyone that could potentially use that generic ID then needs a license. So if something is set up with a generic ID and the only thing a potential user needs to do is log on through your LDAP, that could be all your employees. So that could be a very expensive mistake. The other pitfall is I've seen clients not count their users from the front end when there's a multiplexing situation. IBM software products can work very well with other software, so the user may not be aware that there's an IBM product behind the scenes. So in this diagram from IBM, this is the architecture they've presented for their archiving software, Content Collector, which is used with SAP. So the front end user is using SAP, but every user that is granted the ability to access the Content Collector archive or images also needs a Content Collector user license. You can't just buy one user license and treat it with the same rights as an app adapter or connection. You have to license all users. Okay, software-specific things like what is licensed. There's many title-specific rules for IBM software, and there's maybe changes between versions, so you have to be careful and up to date on what the rules. Some are simpler, like DR. Sometimes warmer idle standby requires full licensing or a partial quantity. DB2 has been the one to watch for years because there's others. Although many defined resources are activated processor cores, it's best to check. It's not worth the surprise. And the last one, I guess, gets under my skin for another reason, but there's a handful of PVU products that define within the software title which server is licensed. So for TSM, which is called Spectrum now, you need to license the systems that are managed by the program. There's a couple others that are similar, and where you license the PVUs for the systems that are accessed by the program rather than where it's installed. So that revelation or methodology leads into our next topic, because it's a good example of how licensing can snowball into a bigger problem for you. As many teenagers and IBM licensees say, I know, but there's so much. I know I haven't seen it all, and I certainly don't remember it all. I see the bigger problem as the application of some knowledge with a dose of wishful thinking or common sense or just a wave of a hand that is too complicated to look into further. So let's go back to the idea on that last slide. I need to license the servers that are managed or accessed by a program, not the server it's installed on. So at this point, I say I know what I need to license, and I work out how many PVUs I need to own. So we're good. But also in the description of those software titles is the usual lingo from IBM about licensing PVUs by full capacity or subcapacity. For this software title, am I meeting the subcapacity licensing terms in the Passport agreement? Actually, I'm not, because ILMT, IBM's license metric tool, reports where the software is installed. And I don't like that, because I want to license by subcapacity instead of full capacity. And you know what? This is IBM's fault that ILMT doesn't report the right servers. And actually, it's common sense that I get to license these by subcapacity. So we're still good. I mean, you can portray a high degree of confidence in this kind of belief, but and say, I got enough licenses, we're good, bring on the audit. But the result's not going to be favorable to you because you're not applying all the rules that went with that software product. And also with the Passport Advantage Agreement, where ILMT is reporting and giving you the rights to license at subcapacity. Okay, the next one is you can claim that licensing terms don't apply because you have a licensing exception. I mean, IBM does grant them. And so what's a licensing exception look like? You can ask IBM for one. But in the transaction with IBM, you need to propose in your request how you will license and possibly what steps you're going to take. We try a big one here. I want subcapacity licensing. I'm going to use Flexera instead of an IBM tool to monitor my PVU deployments on servers. Flexera has gotten their tool really good at receiving input from agents every 30 minutes like ILMT. So IBM will prepare a written statement or exception that covers your subcapacity licensing if you meet similar criteria with your Flexera tool. You'll generate reports at least quarterly, you'll verify them as accurate, and you'll keep a copy on file to provide IBM or the auditor if they request it. So you get the written exception because you've presented this to IBM, but where you can run into trouble is if you don't install Flexera. You don't run reports. You don't even check them to see if they're accurate. So I've had a lot of emails forwarded to me because I do a lot of IBM audits and help people with them. And they'll send me their emails to review as this is what my rep said. Sometimes they're spot on. They're applying the information they were given. Other times the quote-unquote exception doesn't say what they thought it said. While it may contain some info, if it ends with, you should review how many servers you're going to use to make sure you have enough licensing, that gives me the impression that everything that preceded that sentence should be taken as an example of how to calculate PVUs. You could also run into issues by not getting a formalized exception in writing from IBM. I mean, to be fair, how does an auditor have something to validate if you have nothing in writing or it's even from an unreliable source, like an outsider's blog post or something? Another one that comes up sometimes is my rep or reseller said, don't worry about it. And, it could be a conversation, and maybe she did or didn't say that, but they have been told, they could have told someone else in your organization, or it's not really a strong defense since it may be a conversation. If you call up your sales rep and say, I need 140 PVUs of DB2, and they sell it to you, that is not a confirmation that you only require 140 PVUs to cover any deployments that you make of DB2. Or there may be something on your ordering document that says the passport agreement is applicable. Also, when the software is downloaded from IBM, there should be a mention of the Passport Advantage agreement that you're downloading and deploying based on IBM's licensing rules. And at the end of the day, when you're under audit, it's up to your company to own the licenses you need in order to use IBM's intellectual property. And then, or my rep or reseller said, don't worry about it. That's kind of gray because they might be even referencing something else or a different configuration or a different software product or metric. You may make additional deployments that need more licenses after they talk to you. So that's, it's not really written in stone with what they're saying don't worry about.
All right. I know some of you have some questions, but we are out of time at the moment. What we're going to do is everyone who asked a question during the webinar, we're going to follow up with you after the event and answer your questions on a one-on-one basis. So that concludes today's webinar. Thank you for joining. If you have any further questions, again, if you didn't ask them already and you would like a one-on-one session with us, please email us at sales@miroconsulting.com, call us at 732-738-8511, or visit us on the web at miroconsulting.com. That concludes today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. Have a great day.